Evil Dead: Hail to the King
was released in America on December 4th of 2000. It was developed by Heavy Iron Studios and published by the now-defunct THQ. Hail to the King is actually a continuation of the story, taking place after Army of Darkness.
First though, I gotta say, things start off pretty good.
Groovy.
A lot of the environments seem to be really faithful to the second movie, from the layout of the cabin, the work shed out the back. Got a few key areas to explore here, all spread out around the cabin. There's a scout camp nearby, a hillbilly's house, plus all these winding paths of the forest, which are just outright mazes, and that's for starters. Although Ash is a mess of blurry pixels and polygons, they sure nailed the look of his outfit, his hair, plus his trademark chainsaw arm. It's just kind of a shame that the CGI model in the cinematics looks absolutely nothing like Bruce Campbell. There's some real Resident Evil vibes early on here too, like running away from these floating skull things. It's kind of like the crows from the Spencer Mansion. Plus there's an underground cave complex ending in a boss fight similar to fighting the Black Tiger in Resident Evil.
You'll notice that Ash has the same sort of spinny tank controls that you have in classic Resident Evil. This game has a save system that requires tape or ribbon of some sort. A save tape. In Resident Evil you use the ink ribbon with typewriters, and so you'd expect to save at like reel-to-reel audio recorders or something. No, in this game these tapes somehow work with chests.
You've got inventory management, even having to shuffle items through a universally accessible chest, and crafting your own health and chainsaw fuel. Plus, I really like the aesthetic for all these pre-rendered backgrounds. Got the dimly lit forest with eerie fog, and the usage of camera techniques like Dutch tilts for some of the fixed perspective stuff gives the whole thing a pretty stylized look. Also, having Bruce Campbell doing all the voice work just makes it feel that much more authentic.
Thanks but no thanks, Doughboy. My scouting days are over.
In fact, at any time with the press of a button, you can let him bust out one of his scathing one-liners.
Come get some.
Sadly though, it's not going to take too long to see that this thing is just a pretty big pile of shit, and that'll happen almost as soon as you encounter your first enemy. Because although Hail to the King looks and feels like a survival horror game with tank controls and limited resources, it really doesn't play like one, and that's mainly because of the style of the combat and the behaviour of all these enemies. The thing is, you're in combat almost constantly, especially early on, and on top of that, enemies do not seem to stop spawning in. Compared to other survival horror games where the enemies are often preset and just roam in a single area, the enemies in Hail to the King seem to mostly appear at random, and as soon as you kill one of them, another one just pops right up to take its place. Oh, and the worst thing is sometimes you'll leave an area, and a couple of them are just going to be waiting right on the other side, pretty much blocking you in, which, yeah, that's always fun. Trying to run away from these guys is kind of impossible because the majority of environments are more or less just narrow pathways which can barely fit Ash, let alone an enemy. And then killing them is also kind of pointless because they're just going to respawn a few seconds later anyway.
Surprise! And just look how many swings he takes. They also do this wacky bit where they disappear into the ground for a few seconds only to appear in pretty much the exact same spot. It doesn't really give them an advantage, it just kind of seems to draw the fights out longer. And the combat's just really stiff and awkward. Luckily, at this stage in the game, enemies all seem to drop health kits. And while this is a major survival horror no-no, in this game, I doubt I'd be able to get anywhere without being able to heal after nearly every fight. And it quickly becomes very apparent that these ghosts have no intention of leaving you alone anytime soon. You can't seem to go but a few steps without another one spawning and doing that exorcist puke at you. Or just making your life difficult in general. Scattered around the various areas, you'll find these red and brown mushrooms. These are used with the converter, but since that does nothing, these things do zippity squat. And like in Resident Evil, you can't drop items unless you're at a chest. So of course the problem here is, if you fill up your slots picking up these currently useless mushrooms, you'll have no room left for a key item that you need in order to move the game forward. The game also seems to have quite a few glitches. Oh, most of these are just harmless little visual anomalies. Some of them are... fucking terrifying. So it was at this point that I decided to save my game in order to take a little break. When I came back and loaded my save, I had somehow gotten wedged between the chest and the wall. I tried absolutely everything that I could, but I could not get free. This only happened once, but it cost me 45 minutes of playtime.
There's a section early on here which is a literal maze, and you're not only navigating it and having to keep your bearings, but also trying to find an important quest item, along with dealing with Mr. Bones popping out of the dirt every 2 seconds.
This foresty maze place, as far as I'm concerned, it's the worst area in the whole goddamn game. Everything looks the same, so it's impossible to navigate, and it's populated by these annoying prancy skeleton deadites who spin at you and then skip away when they feel like you've been bullying them too much. They also seem to hit a bit harder than the ghosts do. And of course these cockmongers won't give you 2 seconds to figure out where the fuck you're supposed to go next. By the end of it, I was just running through the thing while being followed by a parade of gleefully bounding jackasses.
I mean, look, I admire the sight of a skeletal corpse popping out of the ground as much as the next man does, but at least give me some time to get my bearings in between making me beat on these guys' chests like it's a goddamn xylophone. The one consolation is that the game does often drop ammo and medkits whenever you kill enemies, so at least it's not entirely for nothing. And honestly, I wouldn't mind killing monsters playing as Ash Williams if only the combat weren't one of the worst things ever made. Obviously, Ash is a little bit impaired when it comes to working hands, and securely slotted onto his right arm is of course his trusty chainsaw. At any point you can swing this thing around for a basic melee attack, and if you turn it on, assuming you've got fuel, it does a bit more damage as well.
Using the chainsaw makes life a bit easier, but you have a limited time to use it because of the whole fuel mechanic thing. And even with a full tank of gas, it only lasts about 30 seconds. So a lot of battles will have you wailing on enemies with your chainsaw, cutting it off quickly when they disappear, turning it back on when they reappear, and then repeating the whole process. It just ends up feeling like busy work.
Then on the other hand, literally, you can carry an axe, a pistol, a shotgun, and a rifle. The thing is though, is that none of these are really all that great. The pistol is pretty much useless. I mean, it does so little damage that it's about as effective as trying to kill someone with a bowl of mashed potatoes. Same thing with the shotgun. I mean, it just doesn't have that kind of impact that you'd really want it to. And that right there, my friends, is a criminal offense, especially for an Evil Dead game. I mean, compare that to the shotguns in the Resident Evil games.
You got that?
In those games, you worry about running into enemies because you have limited ammo or limited healing items. It's tense and engaging. It's what made the game scary and why they work in the genre. In this game, you're also worried about running into enemies, but not because they've built any atmosphere or tension. It's more that you just don't want to be inconvenienced by them.
There's that rifle in the game too, but again, it's really underwhelming, and the crappy damage doesn't really justify how little ammo you're given for it. Once you get to the 9th century, you can upgrade these into better versions, but they're still about as damaging as hitting someone in the face with a wet sock. So what it means is that the vast majority of combat, for me anyway, just came down to using the chainsaw and the axe. It just kind of seemed to be the most effective, especially considering that most enemies attack you at melee range anyway. Pistols, shotguns, and rifles need ammo and to be constantly reloaded. On the other hand though, there's no limit to the amount of times you can hit someone in the face with an axe or a chainsaw.
Swallow this.
And this is really just about mashing those attack buttons for both of these weapons over and over on the enemies until they finally go down.
And that's the general flow of the game.
And it probably wouldn't be an issue if you could just run right past these enemies, but like I said, that's a luxury the game just doesn't offer us.
Say hi to Disco for me.
Later on near the end of the game, the chainsaw gets upgraded to a circular saw, which honestly might be one of the most badass things of all time. And if I wasn't so pissed off with how crappy every other aspect of this game is, that might have actually pepped up my spirits. It's just not a very good combat system, let me just put it that way. And that ain't even bringing up all of the weird issues with delayed or ignored control inputs, which means you'll often take damage far more than you mean to, and that's even more annoying. All I'll say is just get used to hearing that short audio clip of Ash grunting in pain, because it's going to be burned into your brain by the end of this thing. You know, assuming you're patient enough to get that far. Now, for almost that entire first area in the forest surrounding the cabin, you're fighting these ghost-looking things.
Yep, that's what I think of when I think Evil Dead. Ash swinging an axe at a vomiting ghost.
The manual says that they're deadites, only I don't remember any of the deadites from the movies looking like this and materializing out of the ground to spit acid at you. And I don't care if they've been portrayed that way in some stupid spin-off comic where Ash teamed up with the Ghostbusters or the Ninja Turtles or some stupid shit like that. I don't care about that stuff. My point is that they're not very fun to fight, and it doesn't get any better when you travel either, because you're still fighting the same looking deadites and spooky skeletons, only this time the skeletons happen to be wearing armor. Then there's these things, which are like demonic headless chickens, I guess? I don't know, man. The worst it gets is inside a temple against these cultist looking dudes, who have this really powerful AoE attack and they soak up like a bazillion hits before dying. Thankfully, you only have to fight them a handful of times, which is good because they kinda suck.
And I gotta tell you, this section is a lot less of a headache than the previous one was. Mostly because it's extremely linear and there's a lot less ambiguity on where you're supposed to go and what you're supposed to do. there are a few new enemy types, like these robed assholes who are a bit of a pain to put down, and these little jumpy things that are only rarely able to hit me at all. In fact, I was excited later on when they just kept appearing because it meant I essentially was getting free health pack drops. And you fight a few bosses that are pretty much taken down by you getting right up in their face and wildly swinging your chainsaw.
There's like this unique combat mechanic where if you hit a stunned enemy with your revved up chainsaw, Ash is going to impale them, and then using your primary weapon, he'll execute them and spout off one of his famous one-liners.
Munch on this.
But half the time this doesn't even work, and it only seems to occur with specific enemy types to begin with. Plus, I have no idea what the purpose of it is to begin with. I mean, I think it increases the likelihood of enemies dropping more health or ammo, but to be honest, I really can't tell. I will say one thing though, which is that the game's RNG system for dropping items always seemed to drop stuff just when I needed it the most. Whenever I was running out of healing items or ammo, it seemed that enemies would always drop the one item I needed just when it was starting to become a concern. It's not the biggest praise, you know, but considering we're drowning in an Atlantic Ocean-sized swimming pool of bad design choices, I've got to give commendations whenever possible.
Who's laughing now, huh?
But you know what I think hurts the most about this is that you can genuinely see the potential that this thing could have had. And there is a real sense of love for the franchise buried under all of this muck. The concept is actually pretty interesting. There's a really funny sequence where the game wants you to complete this needlessly complex puzzle to get through a locked door or something, but then Ash just more or less breaks the fourth wall and shoots it open with his shotgun. It really feels like they understand how Ash works as a character, and they put him into these various situations and have him act accordingly.
Well, hello, Mr. Fancy Pants.
I might have already said this before, but I really like some of the visuals in those starting environments. At one point, it's almost got like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre feel to it, where you're inside this weird house full of furniture that looks like it's made out of body parts or something. But then you have to fight, and you're reminded just how bad things truly are. At times, the whole thing almost kind of feels like a bit of a boss rush, and it seems like every few minutes you're taking on some kind of tough new enemy. Save for a few of them though, you can kill them pretty easily by just spamming your chainsaw or your axe on them over and over.
Suck on this.
Most of the tactics for beating bosses is really just to hit them as quickly as possible, trying to avoid getting hit back too much in return. Or just run to one side of a room, shoot it a bunch of times, then run to the other side of the room and repeat. Or if you've got enough healing items, just trading blows and healing when necessary. Half the time I completely missed the boss's health bar appearing at the top right of the screen, and I just kind of assumed it was a basic enemy. About the most creative it gets is a fight against a dude in heavy armor, and I gotta admit, that's pretty cool. The final showdown just comes down to slowly backing away while shooting at him over and over. Or if you're lucky, getting him stuck on a piece of the scenery like a complete idiot. Yeah, nice one, dumbass.
You kick his ass and he morphs
Into what looks like a giant rooster if it ever got infected by John Carpenter's The Thing virus.
and he's a goddamn pushover. If you have a few health packs, he's no trouble at all. Final boss? Done. And no, I don't get it, but if it means less aggravation, I'm not going to question it.
Hail to the King is played across 2 discs. Got the first one for the starting areas in the present day, and then the second one for when Ash is transported. But despite that, it's actually a pretty short game, and I managed to beat it in around 3 or so hours, which is more of a mercy than anything else. I also probably spent a good solid chunk of that time just mashing the interact button on something that I knew I had to interact with, but for some reason that sweet spot for activating it was just really hard to find. You know what's most shocking about all of this too is that this thing came out in the year 2000. Looking at it from a distance, you'd think it was what, like a mid-90s game, considering it looks a lot like the first Resident Evil game, which came out like 4 years prior. Now also consider that Resident Evil Nemesis had come out on the PlayStation barely a year before, which in my opinion just shits all over this. In terms of the controls, the combat, the puzzles, the visuals, you know, pretty much everything. Even Silent Hill came out a year earlier and it runs rings around this thing too. Hail to the King also got released on the Sega Dreamcast, and if you look at the timeline of games released for that thing, it's also around the same time when Resident Evil Code Veronica was released. Arguably one of the best games in that entire franchise, and again just showing that disparaging difference in quality between both titles. I guess my point is that if you're trying to make some kind of excuse for Hail to the King's shortcomings because it's, you know, a product of its time, well then guess what, that's not really true. Because the other products of the time still stand up a hell of a lot better than this does. Overall, it's like an interesting examination into how poorly a Resident Evil clone can be, and it's not really worth your time, so you're kind of lucky that I played this thing so you won't have to.
No! No!
Oh man, was that one lame excuse for an Evil Dead game. I mean, it looks alright in most places, and the game so badly wants to be Resident Evil without even getting what makes those games so enjoyable. I don't know if it's actually trying to be survival horror, but it wasn't scary, or even tense. and is trying so hard to fit in with the movies, it's kinda pathetic. It just feels like lame fan fiction that was somehow voiced by Bruce Campbell. At least he's a lot of fun. And thankfully, it was short. Yeah, 11 hours my ass. But here's the weirdest part, guys, and I really have to be honest here. Toward the end, I was actually starting to enjoy myself. Let me leave no room for misinterpretation. This is not a good game. Do not play this game. I am a masochistic Evil Dead fan, and I'm willing to bet in the back of my mind the catharsis that would come from ripping at a new one may have softened the bullshit.